The Crimean War, Part 3. The Fog of War. Inkerman, 1854. The valley of Balaclava still carried the echoes of hooves and gunfire. The bodies of men and horses lay in heaps along the ground where the Light Brigade had charged. The vineyards were scarred by shell craters, the ridges scorched by cannon fire. But for all the bravery shown there, Balaclava had not ended the siege. Sevastopol still held. By now the Russian Black Sea fleet was gone, not defeated in battle but sunk by its own commanders. At the very start of the siege, the great warships of Sevastopol had been scuttled in the harbour, their hulks dragged to the bottom to block the Allied fleets from forcing an entry. Their cannon were hauled ashore, their sailors turned into infantry, and their timbers burned or broken up for the city's defence. What had once been Russia's pride was sacrificed to keep Sevastopol alive. The fortress stood like a clenched fist, trenches deep, batteries bristling, its garrison determined to resist. Around it, the Allied armies dug in, their own trenches creeping forward inch by inch, their camps spreading ragged across the hills. The siege dragged on, cold and relentless, and the Russians, humiliated by Alma and frustrated by Balaclava, resolved to strike again. By early November, the Russian army around Sevastopol swelled to nearly 60,000 men. Reinforcements poured in from across the empire, raw conscripts from the interior, hardened veterans from the Caucasus, artillerymen eager to prove their guns. They outnumbered the British army by more than 3-1. The Tsar's generals knew they could not sit idle. If they allowed the Allies to tighten their grip, Sevastopol would eventually fall. Better to take the fight to the enemy. Better to smash the thin British lines before French reinforcements could shift the balance. The chosen point was the Inkerman Ridge, east of Sevastopol. There the British lines were stretched thin, clinging to steep ground above the Chernaya River. It was a position difficult to supply, vulnerable to assault, and held by barely 8,000 British infantry. Against them, the Russians prepared to hurl more than 40,000 men. The night of the 4th of November was cold and wet. Rain fell in sheets, soaking tents, turning tracks into mud. British sentries shivered at their posts, cloaks wrapped tight, muskets clutched against the chill. In the trenches, men crouched beneath sodden blankets, water dripping through makeshift shelters. The campfires sputtered and hissed. Out beyond the lines, in the darkness, the Russians were on the move. Columns of infantry tramped through the mud, their boots squelching, their greatcoats slick with rain. Their officers urged them on, voices muffled. Artillery rumbled behind, wheels sinking deep into the sodden earth. The plan was to fall upon the British at dawn, overwhelm them in a sudden hammer blow, and sweep them from the ridge. But the weather conspired to make the coming clash something far more terrible. Dawn broke on the 5th of November under a heavy fog. It rolled across the valley in pale sheets, clinging to the ridges, swallowing trees and rocks, muffling sound until the world seemed to shrink to a few dozen yards. Soldiers peered into the gloom and saw only shadows. Muskets glistened with damp. Powder felt clammy in its pouches. One British officer later wrote, "The fog was so thick you could scarce see your hand before your face." The ground was sodden, the air heavy with damp, and all about us hung a silence that made the hair rise upon one's neck. Into that fog came the Russians. The first sign was the sound. A low, rolling murmur like distant surf. The tramp of thousands of boots, then the creak of wagons, the rumble of wheels, the clank of bayonets against musket barrels. Shapes loomed grey upon grey, figures swelling out of the mist, and then the crack of a musket, sharp and sudden, shattering the stillness. The Russian vanguard struck the British pickets in a flurry of shots. Outposts were overrun, sentries cut down, survivors stumbling back to warn the main line. Bugles blared in the fog, drums beat a dull tattoo, and the hillsides came alive with the roar of advancing men. The Battle of Inkerman had begun. On the British ridge, soldiers scrambled to arms. Men tumbled from their tents, fumbling with belts and packs, jamming cartridges into pouches. Officers shouted orders, barely audible above the growing din. Colours were unfurled. Companies formed as best they could in the murk. There was no time to prepare proper lines. The Russians were already upon them, tens of thousands against a few thousand. What should have been an ordered defence dissolved into fragments. Companies fought where they stood, blind and half-surrounded, relying on instinct and courage. The Guards' regiments, Grenadiers, Coldstreams, Scots Fusiliers braced themselves on the slopes. Thin ranks of red vanished into mist, bayonets jutting, rifles ready. They faced grey shapes surging uphill, Russian columns pressing forward with drums beating, voices crying out in guttural shouts. The first volleys cracked through the fog. British Minier rifles barked, their conical bullets cutting through Russian ranks with deadly precision. Men fell in heaps, stumbling over rocks and roots. But the Russians pressed on, firing blindly, muskets flaring, the smell of powder thick in the damp air. The clash was sudden and brutal. Bayonets met bayonets, steel grinding, men grappling in the mud. Muskets were swung as clubs, fists and boots came into play. Officers hacked with swords, their scabbards flung aside. It was not neat, not ordered. It was chaos. A guardsman recalled, "The fog was so dense that we fired into it not knowing whom we struck. At times the enemy was upon us before we knew they were near, and it was hand to hand, muzzle to muzzle, a slaughter more than a battle. The Russians brought up their guns. Cannons boomed in the mist, shells bursting above the British positions, showering iron fragments down upon men who could not even see the batteries firing. The hills shook with the thunder, the fog lit in flashes of orange flame. Still the British held. Small groups formed knots of resistance, rallying around officers, colours, or simply the stubborn will to stand. One company of the 20th Foot, reduced to a handful of men, fought back to back on a knoll until only 3 remained. A sergeant of the Grenadiers rallied stragglers with the cry, "Stand fast, lads. This ground is ours or we die upon it." Again and again the Russians surged forward. Again and again they were met by volleys and cold steel. But the weight of numbers told. By mid-morning British positions were buckling. Ammunition was running low. Companies had lost half their strength. Officers were down. Colours shot through. Formations scattered. Whole units were nearly annihilated. The Russians pressed ever closer, their columns swelling from the fog, bayonets glinting, voices raised in hoarse cries. One Guards officer described it as an ocean of grey rolling in waves upon our thin shore. It seemed that the line could not hold, that the ridge would be overrun, that the British army might be swept from Inkerman altogether, and then, faint at first, then stronger, came the sound of French bugles rising through the mist like a call from salvation. General Bosquet had dispatched battalions of Zouaves and line infantry to support the collapsing British front. Their bright red trousers and fezes seemed ghostly in the fog, flashes of colour amid the grey murk. They came at the double, muskets shouldered, officers waving swords and shouting encouragement. Their arrival was timely, almost providential. British companies, reduced to tatters, staggered back to reform behind their allies. The French pressed forward to take their place, delivering volleys that cut into Russian columns at close range. The sharp bark of the French Minier rifles echoed like whip-cracks across the ridge. But even with French support, the ground was far from secure. The Russians hurled wave after wave into the fight, their officers driving them on with curses, and the flat of sabres. The fog swallowed formations, confused orders, and threw friend and foe into sudden collision. Inkerman had become not a battle of manoeuvre, but a series of desperate struggles in the mist. A Coldstream guardsman later recalled, "You saw a shape looming through the fog, and only when it was upon you did you know if it was friend or enemy. We fired at shadows. We stabbed at men who were inches away, our faces black with powder, our bayonets red with blood. There was no line, no order, only knots of men locked in mortal combat. The ground became a butcher's yard. Muskets were fired muzzle to muzzle, the powder singeing eyebrows, the flame scorching faces. Bayonets punched into chests, bellies, throats. When cartridges were spent, men swung their rifles like clubs, iron ramrods cracking skulls, musket butts shattering jaws. Officers wielded their swords with grim fury, hacking at shapes half seen through the drifting fog. The very air seemed to writhe with screams, in Russian, in English, in French. On one rocky slope, a company of the 41st Regiment fought until nearly annihilated. Surrounded by Russian infantry, they stood in a shallow depression, firing until smoke and powder blinded them, then fixing bayonets for a final charge. They went in with a cheer that echoed briefly before being swallowed by the fog. Only a handful staggered back. Elsewhere, the 77th Foot clung to a spur above the valley, firing down into advancing Russians until their ammunition was gone. They hurled stones, swung bayonets like knives, even used bare fists. Their colonel was shot dead, their colours nearly taken, yet they held until French reinforcements arrived to drive the enemy back. Everywhere, the story was the same. Isolated groups, surrounded, fighting desperately against overwhelming odds. The Russians pressed their attack with grim determination. Columns of infantry climbed the slopes, their drums pounding, their officers bellowing encouragement. Great masses of men collided with British and French knots, fighting blind, muskets cracking, steel clashing. Artillery added to the horror. Russian batteries on the heights lobbed shell after shell into the fog, the explosions tearing holes in friend and foe alike. British guns replied when they could, their gunners working like fiends, the recoil of each blast, sending them sprawling in the mud. One battery lost nearly every horse and half its crews, yet the survivors dragged ammunition by hand, determined to keep their guns firing. The smoke and fog mingled until sight itself seemed a curse. The men fought by instinct, by sound, by the feel of an enemy's breath on their faces. A sergeant of the Grenadier Guards left an account that chills even on the page. It was a madness. The fog was so thick that men fired into one another at yards' distance. I saw one of ours strike a Russian with his bayonet, and both fell together, neither rising. My hands were cut and bleeding from the lock of my musket, yet I scarce noticed. The cries of the wounded were everywhere, but none could go to them, for the fight was upon us on all sides. And so Inkerman earned its grim name, the soldiers' battle. Not won by generals with maps, but by private men with bayonets. By mid-morning the British line was fractured, hanging by threads. Entire regiments were shadows of themselves. The Guards had lost half their officers. The 2nd Division had been reduced to knots of exhausted survivors. Lord Raglan, high on the heights, could send few orders that carried meaning. The fog swallowed messengers. The chaos defied all command. But the spirit of the soldiers held. They clung to every rise, every trench, every wall of stone. They would not yield. And the French, arriving in great numbers, stiffened the defence. Zouaves fought like wolves in the mist, their cries fierce, their bayonets merciless. Line infantry marched in columns that dissolved into swirling melees, holding their ground with stubborn resolve. The battle seesawed, back and forth. One moment Russian columns gained a spur, banners raised, bayonets glittering. The next, British volleys cut them down. French counterattacks drove them reeling back into the fog. The ground was littered with bodies, churned mud slick with blood, muskets discarded, cartridge boxes emptied. On one ridge, Russian grenadiers seized a battery of British guns, bayoneting the gunners where they stood. For a moment they seemed triumphant, turning the pieces to fire downhill. But guardsmen rallied, storming the height with bayonets fixed, cutting down the intruders and retaking the guns at dreadful cost. Every gain was paid for in blood, every loss avenged in kind. Amid the confusion, moments of stark heroism shone. At one point, a lone British officer, Major Fraser, rallied a handful of stragglers and led them straight into a Russian column, firing pistols at point-blank range before going down in a storm of bayonets. His sacrifice bought precious minutes for others to regroup. Another Guards officer, Colonel Henry Cadogan, fought like a lion until riddled with bullets, his last act to shout his men forward even as he collapsed. His Guards carried on with a cheer, driving the Russians back over his fallen body. Even ordinary soldiers etched their names into legend. One fusilier was seen fighting on with his musket, though his arm was broken, jamming cartridges into the barrel with his teeth. A Highlander, out of ammunition, wielded a captured Russian bayonet in each hand until he was dragged down. The French, too, bled heavily, but their determination never wavered. Zouaves charged uphill with cries of "En avant!" driving Russians before them. Chasseurs fired volley after volley, their blue coats vanishing into the fog. They had come to save their allies, and they did so with relentless courage. By noon, the Russians had thrown nearly 40,000 men into the fray, but the British and French, barely a quarter of that number, had not broken. Their lines bent, shattered, reformed, and bent again. But still they stood. The fog that had been the Russians' ally now turned against them. Confused, disoriented, unable to coordinate their massed columns, they attacked piecemeal, their strength dissipated in countless small clashes rather than a single hammer blow. What was meant to be overwhelming became chaotic, and chaos was the element of the defenders. The battle roared on into the early afternoon. The slopes were thick with smoke and mist, the ground carpeted with corpses. The air stank of powder, blood, and churned earth. Men staggered like phantoms through the haze, eyes red, hands black with grime. Muskets fouled with powder until they barely fired. Bayonets bent from use. Men swung weapons so battered they seemed to hold together by will alone. And still the Russians came, but the Allies were holding, barely, by bayonet and bullet, by stubborn grit and sheer defiance. They clung to the Inkerman ridge, and as the fog swirled and the sun sank lower, a terrible realization dawned in the Russian command. Their massive assault, tens of thousands of men, had failed to break a few thousand British and French. The tide of battle, slow and bloody, was beginning to turn. The hours dragged on like years. By early afternoon, the fog still clung to the ridges, but the battlefield had become a landscape of ruin. Bodies carpeted the slopes, the cries of the wounded rising in an unending chorus. And yet, amid that horror, the fight went on. Russian generals urged their men forward again and again. Columns were reformed in the valleys, drums beating through the mist, bayonets bristling as they mounted the slopes once more. The plan had been for a swift, overwhelming assault, but by now the offensive had devolved into fragments. Regiments stumbled into battle piecemeal, one brigade after another, colliding with British and French defenders who fought with the fury of cornered wolves. Each attack cost dearly. Each surge dissolved into smoke and blood. Around noon, the Russians made one final, massive push. Tens of thousands surged out of the mist, their grey coats billowing like shadows, their officers waving swords and urging them on. They struck at the centre of the ridge, hoping to smash the last British positions and seize the high ground once and for all. The Guards met them head-on. What was left of them? The Grenadiers, Coldstreams, Scots Fusiliers, regiments reduced to half strength, sometimes less. Their officers dead or wounded, their ammunition nearly gone. Yet they stood shoulder to shoulder. They fired what shots remained, then fixed bayonets and hurled themselves into the oncoming tide. The clash was apocalyptic. Men fought in knots, bayonets plunging, musket butts swinging, boots slipping in blood-slick mud. Smoke hung thick so that men grappled without knowing whether the foe before them was Russian, British or French. And then the French struck again. Fresh battalions, chasseurs and zouaves marched into the storm. Their bugles rang, their volleys cracked like thunder, and their bayonets gleamed as they charged uphill into the Russian flank. The timing was decisive. The Russians, already mauled and disoriented, could not withstand the shock. Their attack faltered, then it buckled. By mid-afternoon, the momentum had shifted. The Russians, exhausted, demoralised, began to fall back. Slowly at first, then faster, their columns withdrew into the fog. Guns were abandoned, standards left trampled in the mud. The ground ceded inch by inch. The British and French did not pursue far. They were too spent, too bloodied. They stood among the wreckage, muskets lowered, chests heaving, scarcely able to believe they had survived. The fog lifted slightly as the day waned, revealing the scale of the slaughter. On the slopes of Inkerman Ridge, thousands of Russian dead lay strewn in heaps. Grey-coated bodies sprawled over rocks, tangled in thickets, piled around captured guns. Horses lay broken among them, their bodies twisted, their eyes glassy. The British and French lines were scarcely less grim. Whole companies reduced to handfuls, regiments gutted. The ground was littered with shattered muskets, bent bayonets, torn packs. Cartridge boxes lay empty, their straps cut where men had torn them open in desperation. One Guards officer wrote, "The ridge was a charnel house. We stood knee-deep in corpses, the fog still clinging, the smell of blood choking the air. I felt no triumph, only exhaustion and horror. The wounded cried out in every tongue, Russian, English, French, begging for water, for help, for the mercy of a surgeon's knife. Stretcher-bearers moved as best they could, lifting men slick with blood, carrying them back through the mud. Surgeons' tents overflowed, saws and scalpels working ceaselessly, chloroform running low, brandy poured down throats to dull the agony. The piles of severed limbs grew outside the canvas walls. The moans within carried far into the night. By dusk the Russians were gone. Their army, having hurled 40,000 men against the ridge, had failed. The Allies, fewer than 20,000, with only a fraction engaged and had held their ground. The Russians had suffered nearly 12,000 casualties, the British 3,000, the French 1,000 more. For their numbers, the cost had been staggering, but Inkerman was not remembered for numbers. It was remembered for the manner of the fight. This was not Alma, where armies had clashed in ordered lines, not Balaclava, with its set pieces and legendary charges. Inkerman was chaos, a battle fought by individuals and small groups, blind in the fog, locked in brutal hand-to-hand struggle. No general had directed it. No grand strategy had prevailed. It was won by the stubborn grit of soldiers who refused to yield. That is why it was called the soldiers' battle. For the Russians, Inkerman was a humiliation. They had brought overwhelming numbers, planned a crushing blow and been repulsed by a fraction of their strength. Their officers blamed the fog, the confusion, the rugged ground. But the truth was plainer. The British and French had fought with a ferocity they had not expected. For the Allies it was both triumph and tragedy. Triumph that they had held against impossible odds. Tragedy that so many had fallen, that the battlefield was a slaughterhouse, that victory tasted of ashes. One British private summed it in his diary. "We fought like lions in the fog, and the lions are all dead." In London and Paris, the news brought shock and pride. Newspapers hailed the heroism of the thin red ranks who had stood against a host. Sermons thundered of providence, of courage, of the righteousness of the cause. Families wept over casualty lists, even as the nation celebrated the stand. In St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas was enraged. Inkerman shattered his hope of breaking the siege by force. From that moment on, Sevastopol would endure a grinding defence, but the dream of sweeping the Allies from Crimea was gone. Inkerman was the last great Russian offensive of the war. And yet, for the men who fought there, the memory lingered not in speeches or headlines, but in shadows. The fog that swallowed friend and foe. The sudden shock of grappling with unseen enemies. The cries of comrades vanishing into the mist, never to be seen again. For them, Inkerman was not a battle of glory. It was a nightmare. But in history's gaze, Inkerman mattered deeply. It showed that resolve could overcome numbers, that modern warfare was no longer the clean lines of parade ground drill, but smoke, confusion, attrition. It foreshadowed the struggles of future wars, where trenches, fog, and grinding endurance would define victory. The battle also bound Britain and France closer together. Their soldiers had bled side by side, saved one another in the fog. Their alliance, sometimes brittle in politics, was hardened in blood on the ridge of Inkerman. The siege of Sevastopol ground on. Winter descended. Hunger, disease, and cold would kill almost as many as the guns. But after Inkerman, the Russians never again tried to break the Allied lines with a great assault. The battle had cost them too dearly. Inkerman was, in truth, a soldier's victory, won not by orders but by courage, by men who, in the fog of war, clung to one another and would not let go. But even as the guns fell silent on the ridge, the war was far from over. Inkerman had broken Russia's last great offensive, yet it left the Allies chained to the mud and misery of the siege. Winter closed in, bringing hunger, frostbite, and death in the camps. And ahead, looming like a spectre, was Sevastopol itself, a fortress that would resist for nearly a year, devouring thousands of lives before it finally fell. The end of the Crimean War would not come with one battle in the fog, but with the long grinding agony of the fall of Sevastopol. Join us next time for the fourth and final chapter of the Crimean War, as we descend into the brutal siege and witness the fall of Sevastopol, the battle that would decide the fate of the Crimean War. Thank you for listening to Fireside History. If this story moved you, please like, comment and subscribe. Your support helps keep the fire burning.